before I get going on this, I'm just curious, how many people in the audience today can identify with the topic I'm going to discuss today? Is anybody out there has a father, uncle, cousin, friend that went missing in action in the Pacific War? Okay. Maybe sometime later in the day, if I get a chance, I'd love to talk to you about it. There's also two parts of this for anybody who finds this lecture of interest. At 12:15, we have a documentary titled The Last Flight Home. It was put together by a couple of colleagues of mine who've been actively involved in the search for aircraft wrecks and their occupants in the Palau Islands. So if you're interested, that'll start about 12:15, and hopefully I'll get through this in 45 minutes so you can take a toilet break if you like. This I like to think of as a work in progress. Some years ago, I originally had set out to write a book about the missing in action, but after having spent some time doing research, contacting family members of individuals who are still missing from the Pacific War, and also individuals and groups who are actively involved in going back to Pacific War battle sites in the search for not only wrecks, but the human remains that may be in those wrecks. But it became apparent after a while that in order to do an adequate job on a book such as that, I'd have to go on the road for prolonged periods of time at great personal expense, something I couldn't justify at the time. But rather than give up completely on the topic, I continued to do research. I continue to maintain contact with family members of those who were listed in missing in action from the Pacific War. And I am also in regular contact with those people who are researchers and actively go out into the field in an effort to locate a missing aircraft or try to find other ships or other places where people have gone missing from the Pacific War. This photograph, by the way, is taken at Punch Bowl Cemetery in Honolulu. In fact, you could see it from the ship where we were in Honolulu, and it's about a 20 or 30-minute walk. If you were to get off the ship and walk straight up the pier and off into town, you could have gone up there and by foot if you're mobile enough. But besides all of the tombstones there of people who died in World War II and the Pacific War, there's also these marble walls. And on these walls are listed the names of all the Americans who were listed as missing in action from the Pacific War. Every square inch of this marble on all sides has a name of somebody missing in action. And these columns, these rectangular columns, go all the way up out of sight, and there's an equal number coming down the other side. There are somewhere around 78,000 Americans listed as missing in action from World War II alone. That does not include World War I, Korea, or Vietnam. Also, about a year and a half ago, I had the opportunity to interview John Jones. He's the last surviving member of the Gilbert Island Coast Watchers. The Gilbert Islands today are known as Kiribati. There were a group of New Zealanders and Australians who were sent out to the Gilbert Islands. Most of them were radiomen, radio operators. There were some military personnel out there. His group was in the northern group, Butaritari, Makin, and a few of the atolls up there. And they went out by ship from Fiji. Most of the coast watchers were dropped off in some of the atolls in the southern Gilbert Islands, such as Tarawa, which is the best well-known, and then the others were scattered up the chain until they got up towards Butaritari and Makin, and that's where John Jones and 6 others were dropped off. Originally, they were put out there to watch for German raiders earlier in the war, 1939, 40, and early 41. They are also put on a lot of other islands as far east as Pitcairn Island and some of the more southerly islands to the south of Australia and New Zealand. So usually when we think of the coast watchers, we think of the coast watchers from the Solomon Islands and PNG area, but they actually had coast watchers scattered throughout the Pacific. Now, when the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor, suddenly they weren't just watching out for German raiders. They had to be concerned about Japanese ships and aircraft that might be coming down. And being in the northern Gilbert Islands, John Jones and his 6 colleagues were among the first Allied personnel to be captured by the Japanese. As a matter of fact, they were captured within 48 hours of the Japanese bombing of Pearl Harbor. As a result, they were sent to Japan and spent the rest of the war in Zentsuji POW camp. It was actually a POW camp that was left over from the Russo-Japanese War. And as a result, they were pretty well treated compared to a lot of POWs and other Japanese POW camps scattered throughout the Pacific, Asia, and also the Japanese home islands. However, their 22 colleagues who were down in the southern Gilbert Islands were not captured until a couple of months later, and they were held there until on 15 October 1942, the American light cruiser Portland, returning to the Solomon Islands from Hawaii, cruised by Tarawa and bombarded the island, and their float plane also flew over there and bombed and strafed a Japanese ship that was in the lagoon. As a result, the Japanese took these 22 coast watchers, they took them out and decapitated them one at a time. Their heads were buried in one pit, their torsos in another pit. Their remains have never been found. However, the Marines, when they landed there in November 1943, were aware of what had happened and put a monument up to these 22 coast watchers. It was maybe a year or so ago that a friend of mine who he was at the Pacific Desk in Wellington. Now, and I don't know if it's my fault or not, he's now New Zealand's High Commissioner to Kiribati. I asked him if that was a promotion or a demotion as a result of what resulted. But while I was on another Princess cruise, he sent me a copy of an old newspaper article going back to 1994, and the subject of the article was that the monument on Tarawa to the coast watchers was in bad condition, and the New Zealand government was getting ready to replace it. Well, I network with quite a few people on Pacific War issues, and a lot of them are involved in MIA issues, such as myself. So when I find something of interest like that, I just kind of batch it out to people just in case they want to see that. And when I did, a colleague of mine by the name of Mark Noah got back to me right away, said he had just returned from Tarawa. He's been working with JPAC. Now, JPAC is Joint POW MIA Accounting Command out of Honolulu, and they are the official body in the United States dedicated to nothing but going around and trying to locate the remains of American servicemen who went missing in action, recovering the remains and identifying them so they can notify the next of kin. And he said that he had taken an interest in the Coast Watcher story as well, and he was out there with some dogs who are trained to locate skeletal remains. And along with some other information that he had, he says he thinks he knows where these remains are. And he was willing to help JPAC excavate the site if they received an official request from the New Zealand and or Australian governments. To make a long story short, this got out to the press in both Australia and New Zealand. It was in newspapers, it was on the radio, it was on some TV shows, and the next thing I know, I'm being bombarded with emails and phone calls from military and civilian personnel and journalists asking me what I know about this. Now, this friend of mine who is the High Commissioner there in Tarawa, he recently was in Honolulu, and one of his purposes for being there was to talk directly with JPAC there about when they were going to come out and help them excavate the sites where these possible remains are, because the New Zealand government did request make a formal request to the U.S. government to get JPAC's help in doing this, because apparently the New Zealand military government, they don't have any personnel dedicated to this sort of forensic activity. His response to me, which was not that long ago, was yes, JPAC plans to come out there and aid in excavating the site, but they didn't give commit to a date. So that still remains to be seen. If there's anybody who can identify with that's out there, if you have any connections in Canberra or Wellington, and you want to put the pressure on them a little bit, might have to take some effort on interested people to get this thing moving again. Now, on the way up to the northern Gilberts, they've stopped at the southern islands, and this is a photograph that John Jones took of some of his friends on Tarawa. There are 6 individuals in that photograph that he took, and he shared this with me. But all 6 of them were among the 22 who were taken out and decapitated. And this was the memorial that the Marines had set up there after Tarawa had been declared secured. Now, I was also interested to find, talking to somebody on a previous cruise, that once the war with Japan started, a lot of these flying boats that were owned by Qantas, I don't know if they were commandeered by the Royal Australian Air Force, if they were put on loan, but whatever, the planes and the crews were taken from their normal commercial routes, and they were assigned tasks such as going up to the Dutch East Indies and helping bring out military and civilian personnel, a lot of Dutch diplomats and their families, a lot of women and children. Some of these flying boats and other aircraft used for evacuating these people out of the Dutch East Indies managed to get safely back to Australia, but a lot of them didn't. Now, one of them, this flying boat that was officered by the individuals you see up there, was one of the flying boats that on the way back from Java disappeared, and neither the plane nor the occupants were ever found. And the reason I took an interest in this is because on a previous Dawn Princess cruise, the daughter of Mervyn William Bateman was in the audience and came up to me afterwards and shared this story with me, and then I did some further research so I could add this to my lecture. I might also add that Merv Bateman's daughter, Jenny, is on this cruise again today, and if she would like to wave, or maybe she doesn't want to wave, she's here in the audience, and she has a really interesting story to tell if you want to talk to her, if you see her around the ship afterwards. And of course, having spent so much time living in the Mariana Islands and researching what happened there, that's actually where I first got my interest in the missing in action, because I kept hearing stories about people who were killed, but somehow their remains were lost or went missing in some fashion or another. One of the people I networked with is a fellow by the name of Ted Darcy. He's a retired Marine. He also somehow, after his retirement from the Marine Corps, got interested in the missing in action from World War II, and did quite a bit of research at the National Archives in Maryland in the U.S. He has probably the best, if not close to the best, database on American MIA and KIA from World War II. According to him, it's even better than what JPAC has. But according to his research, there are 69 unknowns from the Battle of Saipan that are interred at the American Cemetery in Manila in the Philippines. And so just keep that in mind, because I'm going to go into this a little bit more. This is a photograph taken on 15 June as the Marines were landing on Saipan. This was the 4th Marine Division. A friend of mine I've mentioned in previous lectures, Carl Matthews, saw this photo, had it blown up, and he's pretty well convinced that this is him in the photograph, and he definitely recognizes this as a friend of his by the name of Wendell Nightingale. He was a BAR man, and that's what he's holding there, is a Browning automatic rifle. They both survived the landings on the beach, but later in the campaign, in a firefight with some dug-in Japanese, Wendell was shot and killed. They know he was killed. They put his gun in the ground with a bayonet, put his dog tags with it, and with the idea that Graves registration would come along afterwards, recover the body, identify it, and inter it in an area on Saipan dedicated to the 4th Marine Division after the fighting was over. But something happened. The body was misplaced or lost. Very possibly it could have ended up as one of the unknowns at the American Cemetery in Manila. Oh, we don't know. But even though they know he was killed, there was no closure for the family back home because no remains were returned. They received a telegram stating that he was missing in action. And for a while, I had contact with Wendell's younger brother, who lived up in Maine, as I recall. But hopefully, maybe someday, if we can get JPAC to go into the American Cemetery in Manila, maybe some of these unknowns will be identified and any surviving members can have some closure as a result. Now, again, mentioning Carl Matthews, he was the runner for Lieutenant James Stanley Leary. He was a newly minted second lieutenant in the U.S. Marine Corps. They were almost glued at the hip throughout the Battle of Saipan. They survived the battle up until the very last days of the battle when they were up towards the north end of Saipan. They were on a bluff overlooking a flat area below towards the beach. They were talking about something when several shots rang out and Lieutenant Leary was killed. Carl managed to scramble back to safety, and 2 other Marines who tried to retrieve Mr. Leary's bodies were also shot and killed. Matter of fact, the firefight got so hot that their unit had to pull back, and they were never able to get back into the area to retrieve the remains of those 3 Marines. And Carl Matthews, having been wounded earlier, also went into a bit of shock and was evacuated from the island, sent back to the States to recover from his wounds, and that was the end of the war for him. But I guess he wrote a letter to Mr. Leary's mother and father at some stage after he got back to the States, and they insisted on seeing him. So reluctantly he got together with them, sort of became a surrogate son to the mother and father of Mr. Leary, and he stayed in contact with them for as long as they lived. And even after they died, he remained friends with surviving siblings of Mr. Leary. But here was another situation where, for whatever reason, the bodies were either lost or misplaced or maybe even left there for God knows how long. And so even though Carl and some of his colleagues knew that he was killed, the family received a telegram saying he was missing in action. Now, I went back to Saipan in 2004 for the 60th anniversary of the Battle of Saipan. Carl went with me. He hasn't been back there since the war. Given his unit that he was in, given the date that this all took place, I had a pretty good idea as to where it may have happened on Saipan. And so when we got there, I did go to that area, and we were able to hike through there, and he could identify certain physical landmarks that convinced him that this was the area where Stanley Leary and the 2 other Marines were killed. However, combing the area with a number of other people, we couldn't find any skeletal remains, even though it was pretty much overgrown with jungle at that time. I like to go to the old Japanese jails. I mentioned in my lecture on Saipan, there were a number of American airmen who were held there prior to the Marines landing there. One of them, but I think they were both, well, at least no one was a fighter pilot. He was killed by friendly fire. Another one was taken out as the Marines were landing and decapitated. His partially burned remains were found by Marines later as they advanced, and on the flight jacket he was wearing was stenciled the name J.J. Perry. J.J. Perry is a bit of a mystery. I've been working with this on a number of people, especially Ted Darcy, who has this database on the American MIA and KIA from World War II. And he says only J.J. Perry he can find was in a B-24 squadron, and his plane was shot down over the Marshall Islands in 1943. I don't know where he got this photograph, but this photograph is taken by the Japanese of the surviving members of that B-24 that either crash-landed near one of the islands or bailed out over it. All of these individuals that you see in this photograph were shortly afterwards taken out and decapitated by the Japanese. So the mystery of how this body with a jacket with the name J.J. Perry stenciled in it, how it ended up in Saipan is a bit of a bit of a mystery. There are two theories. I've discussed this with a number of people who are interested in the story. Number one is J.J. Perry was a radioman. The Japanese on Saipan had a wireless station there that they used for monitoring Allied radio traffic. It's quite possible that because of his knowledge of U.S. Radio work, he might have been taken there and put to work until some point where they didn't need him anymore. The other possibility is that since his squadron was also involved in the Marianas operation, it's quite possible that one of his squadron mates was wearing his jacket when he had to bail out over Saipan and then was later executed. So I don't think we're ever going to know if that body was really that of J.J. Perry or somebody else. Now, another family I was involved in contact with is from a little town in Ohio. This photograph here is of a fellow by the name of Halloran. He was the pilot of an Avenger off of a Jeep carrier by the name of Gambier Bay. And these are his two crew members, Jack Bacon from Oregon, and this is Howard Rivers, the uncle of the lady I've been in contact with from Ohio. On 17 June, this is D-Day +2 on Saipan, they were sent on a mission above the town of Garapan to bomb a suspected Japanese ammunition dump. In the process of making a glide run at the suspected target, they dropped their bomb but immediately took a hit from an anti-aircraft shell in their bomb bay. The plane caught on fire. Both Rivers and Bacon were seen by Marines in the area to have bailed out, but nobody saw them after that. I might also point out that after the Marines landed, no American, whether they were a soldier, a Marine, or an aviator captured by the Marines, made it out alive. They were all executed by the Japanese once they were captured in some very unpleasant ways, I might also add. Now, Halloran, the pilot, was severely burned but managed to crash land his stricken Avenger on this reef right off a little islet in Tenepec Harbor. This is called Managaha, and he managed to land there. His fighter planes in the area managed to keep the Japanese from coming out in a small boat to capture him. He sat out there for 10 hours. He was severely burned, but they eventually rescued him, and that was the end of the war for him. His ship Gambier Bay was later sunk in the Philippines at the Battle of Samar Island with a loss of quite a few of the crew. Now, going over this with Ted Darcy, he pointed out to me that in Punch Bowl Cemetery in Hawaii, there are a number of graves, but they're marked as unknowns, and they have the date of 17 June 1944 on them. I've talked with Ted Darcy about why JPAC doesn't go out there and exhume these graves. They can get DNA samples from surviving family members and possibly identify them, which would certainly be a great relief to the families. Unfortunately, Ted Darcy doesn't have a very good relationship with JPAC, so they're not always very cooperative with them. And other individuals and groups that are actively involved in trying to locate wreck sites, especially ones with human remains, if they have a good working relationship with JPAC, they usually get faster and better results. But there are a lot of people who are critical of JPAC, and if they're very public about it, well, of course, JPAC is not going to be very responsive. So I hope this will be resolved someday. These graves that are out there with this date that match the date that these individuals disappeared is really quite intriguing to me. I might also mention that if there are 78,000 Americans listed as missing in action from World War II, I think it's fair to say that there are probably 10 times that many Japanese out there. They certainly didn't have the opportunity to recover a lot of the dead that we do. And even to this day, or at least when I was in Saipan, when they came out looking for their war dead, they didn't try to identify individuals. They simply scooped up human remains, assumed that they were Japanese, and then had a funeral pyre out on the north end of Saipan, and they took the ashes back to Japan and interred them at the Yasukuni Shrine, which is a memorial to Japan's war dead. As a result of the fact that they were not trying to identify individuals, and there were so many that they were recovering from all these Pacific islands, I think it's almost 100% sure that some of the skeletal remains that they have collected over the years on various Pacific islands, some of them were Americans. And I think it's quite possible that some of these people, such as Mr. Leary, that his remains have never been found. It's quite possible when the Japanese started coming back in the 1970s with permission from the U.S. government to recover their war dead, and they were just scooping up whatever skeletal remains they found and just assuming they were Japanese. It's very possible that American MIA, such as Mr. Leary, their ashes are now at the Yasukuni Shrine. Now, after this bonsai charge, better known as a yokusai, in the fading days of the battle for Saipan in July 1944, they counted over 4,000 dead Japanese from the yokusai, and what they did in order to get rid of all these remains was they simply took a bulldozer, scooped out a trench, and then you can see all these bodies here. They were simply laid in there and then covered up. Back in 1994, they were getting ready to build a new hotel on this site in a little village on the northwest coast of Saipan called Echugo. In the process of digging some test holes there, they came up with all these skeletal remains and put a halt to it. The Japanese consulate there in Saipan was notified, and in 1995, when we were there, the bone hunters, or really that's what we called them, as the Ministry of Public Health, I think, sent a team out there to excavate the site. And basically what they did to excavate it, they did reverse what you're seeing there. They brought a bulldozer in and started scraping off soil until they came to skeletal remains. And then individuals such as these went in there with hand tools and uncovered the remains. Again, there was no attempt to identify individuals. They estimate that there were something like 500, the remains of 500 individuals in this one trench. They simply scooped them up and then took them out to Marpy Point, which at the end, and they had these funeral pyres. And again, like I said, the ashes were then taken back to Japan and taken to the Yasukuni Shrine. WWII Lackland McVeigh, when I was doing my research on the book for Saipan, I was getting a lot of information from the National Archives in Maryland, and they were sending me also a lot of stuff that I really wasn't looking for, but some of it was quite interesting. And one of the things they sent me was the autopsy report on a WWII Lackland McVeigh. He was an F-6F Hellcat fighter pilot off Yorktown, my old ship. The Yorktown and other carriers made their first carrier airstrike against Saipan in February 1944, some months before the actual landings. In the process of a low-level strafing attack against the Tanapag seaplane ramp that was there, he was shot down by anti-aircraft fire. And his remains were buried in a local civilian cemetery. We know this because after the Marines landed, some of the civilians came up to U.S. Marines and said there was an American pilot that was buried there. They excavated the grave. An autopsy was done. He was identified as WWII Lackland McVeigh by the clothing he still had with his name on it. Maybe dental records were also involved. But again, this is a situation where instead of his remains being interred in one of the local cemeteries dedicated to U.S. dead, or being sent home to be properly buried at Arlington or maybe a family cemetery, again, his remains were misplaced. They were lost. They eventually ended up at the American Cemetery in Manila in the Philippines. When I got this information, I told Ted Darcy about it, made a copy of it, sent it to him, And it took him 3 years, but he actually located the plot in Manila where he was buried. There are still family members. His wife is still alive, but had remarried, and he had a granddaughter. They took DNA samples, compared them, and identified him unequivocally as being Woody Lackland McVeigh. But it took over 60 years before this actually took place. His remains were returned. I think it was to Mobile, Alabama, I think it was he's from. And I received a letter shortly after from his granddaughter thanking me on her behalf and the behalf of the rest of the family for finally bringing some closure to this case after all these years. And if you go into Google and you type in Woody Lackland McVeigh, you can find some old newspaper articles too about not only him but also Ted Darcy's effort to locate his remains. Joe Garofalo, he's from Bronx, New York. I think he's still alive. He was in the Seabees there. He really wasn't involved in the missing in action. He was in the Seabees there, but he told me he had a friend in Bronx, New York, who was a Navy photographer's mate off one of the ships that was at Saipan during the battle. And after the battle was over, one of his assignments was to go ashore and take photographs of the remains of all Americans who had been captured and killed by the Japanese during the fighting there. He thought if I talked to him, I could get some information. Apparently, this guy later, his ship was hit by a kamikaze, and he lost either an arm or a leg. I can't remember. He was quite traumatized by the war, not just the fact that he lost a limb, but as I discovered in talking to him over the phone, the fact that he had to go and photograph the remains of all of these Marines and airmen who had not simply been killed, but they had been tortured in some really horrible ways, and he had to take photographs of it. And as I discovered shortly into our conversation, that I was really not doing him any favors by calling him, because it still bothered him. He spent a lifetime trying to forget about this sort of thing, and then having me call him, it just brought back all these terrible memories, and he started to break down over the phone. So I realized that it was probably time to end that conversation. But I shared this information with Ted Darcy, and he's made several efforts to go to the Naval Historical Archives and the National Archives, trying to see if he could find these photographs and maybe some additional information that might aid him in his quest to at least try to bring some closure to some of these MIA cases. But he never had any success at it, I'm afraid. Patrick Renfrans, he grew up, he was born after World War II, but grew up listening to stories of an uncle of his who was the pilot of a B-24 that went missing over the island of Yap in the Pacific. It was sort of part of the family lore, and at family reunions it was always brought up. He was shown photographs of this uncle that he never knew. He really became quite obsessed with it. And then as an adult, he started going out there every year in an effort to try and find his uncle's B-24. To date, he hasn't had any success, but in the process, he's found other aircraft and helped to identify them. Bent Prop, this is the group that I've been working with. It was set up by Dr. Pat Scannon. As it turned out, he lived only about 20 minutes from me back when we lived in California. I ran into him at a symposium at the Admiral Nimitz Museum in Fredericksburg, Texas. I heard my name being bantered around there. He had a copy of my book about the Battle of Saipan. So him and some of the people who work with him at Bent Prop looked me up. And he's one of these people. He has his own biomedical company. It's called Zoma Corporation, I think it's called. And him and his wife took up scuba diving as a hobby some years back. And one of the places they went to go scuba diving was the Palau Islands. And well, instead of just enjoying the water and the reefs and the colorful fish, they came across an aircraft in one of their dives. So it became really interested. Well, how did this aircraft end up here? Who was the pilot? What happened to the pilot? And so from then on, instead of just going back to the Palau Islands to enjoy scuba diving, he made it his quest to look for some of the aircraft that were shot down and lost over there, with the idea of identifying them, and if they had skeletal remains in there, getting JPAC out there to identify them, and then notifying family members. And there are at least 79 U.S. aircraft that crashed as a result of combat in and around Palau. 58 of them have not been found. But a lot of the ones who have been found by Pat and his bent crop crew. So if this is of any interest of you, if any interest to you, please come back at 12:15 and we'll show you the documentary that some of his colleagues put together. And let me tell you, they spent 7 years going back there every year documenting this. So I think you'll find it of extreme interest. And this is just one of the JPAT crews that came out there to help excavate one of the sites they found. And I also want to move on to Yap Island. They use UDT, or underwater demolition teams, for a variety of purposes. Usually if they had a planned invasion of an island, they would send UDT teams or frogmen in advance to check out the beaches, see what the sand was like, see if there are any coral heads or any other obstructions or that might make it difficult for amphibious landings. Now, at Yap, they had this team that went ashore well in advance of the planned invasion of Yap, an invasion that was later canceled as unnecessary. The thing unusual about this team is that not all of them were UDT. Some of them were SAS. It was a precursor to the CIA. A couple of the people I networked with on this, one of them thinks that they went in there to rescue some Catholic priests that, for whatever reasons, may have been spying for the Americans. Well, I had contact with a number of people who had lived on Yap, and there was a Chamorro family by the name of Untalan there. One of the daughters, one of the twin daughters, was married to a Filipino weatherman who'd lived out there for years, and he was part of an early warning system for the Philippines, because the typhoon tracks that swept through the Philippines often came through these islands first. And if they were getting hit by a typhoon in Yap, he could radio ahead to the Philippines to warn them that it may be heading their way. Well, being that he was Filipino, being that he worked for the Americans, and then the Japanese were there and the war came along, he was immediately suspect. So eventually the Kempeitai, or the Japanese military police, arrested him, all 10 of the Catholic priests, and a number of downed airmen, and took them to Koror, where the Kempeitai headquarters. Well, in the process of these frogmen going ashore, when they came back, they were put ashore by the U.S. submarine Burfish, by the way. 3 of them got lost, didn't make it back to the submarine, and the submarine couldn't wait around much longer. As it turned out, they were captured. They got lost and captured by the Japanese. They too were sent to Koror. Eventually, all of them, I'm not sure about the submarine, the frogmen, but the members of the Huntalan family, I'll move us up a little bit. The Filipino was Agapito Hontanero. His Chamorro wife was Filomena, and they had 2 children, Balthazar and Caroline. They were taken there. They were put in a special compound with the Catholic priests and these airmen, and they were going to be taken out the next day and executed. I happened on Guam to interview the twin sister of Filomena. Her name was Tomasa. She's dead now. And also an uncle of theirs who was a policeman for the Japanese on the island. He told me in his interview that the day before the executions, he went to his niece, Filomena, and said, the Japanese are only interested in your husband. You can walk free along with your children. There's no need for you to stay here. And her response to him, according to his oral history interview, was that, I know they're going to execute my husband, and if they do, they will have to execute me and our children along with him. So basically, she chose not to live without her husband. And there have been attempts in recent years to try to locate the graves of some of these airmen, the Catholic priests, and members of the Untalan Hontanero family. So far, that has not been successful. Also, on a previous cruise, I gave this lecture, and a gentleman came up to me afterwards and asked me if I had ever heard of Keith Rundle. Keith Rundle was his uncle. He was in the RAAF in Australia during World War II, and afterwards was involved for the next 15 years in trying to locate Australian MIAs in the Papua New Guinea area, and he was successful in a number of these areas in locating graves where downed airmen and other Allied POWs had been executed. And also there were a number of Hudson bombers that were shot down over New Britain early in the fighting, January, February, March of 1942. This is one of them that was located. I had a gentleman on another cruise, and he was telling me about his cousin who lived with his family and then joined the RAAF when the war started. And he was on one of these Hudson bombers that was shot down over Gazmata in January 1942. And doing a little bit of research with the help of some other colleagues that I network with, we pretty much identified what's left of this Hudson as being the one that his cousin had disappeared on. Also, I have a friend in Honolulu. He was a missionary in New Britain for 23 years, and he became interested in what happened there during the war, and also was instrumental in finding a lot of airplanes that were shot down in the jungles and waters around New Britain, both American, Australian, and Japanese. And in 2008, they located another one of these Hudson bombers that still had the remains of the crew on it. The Australians sent out their equivalent of JPAC. They excavated the site, found skeletal remains, and also personal artifacts that identified the individuals there. I've had some contact with some of the relatives of the people who were lost on that flight, and a couple of them went back more recently with this friend of mine who now lives in Honolulu to see the site where their family members were lost. Brigadier General Kenneth Walker was with the 5th Air Force under Kinney. He had orders, number one, not to fly on any more missions because he knew too much, and if he were to be shot down and captured by the Japanese, it was almost guaranteed that they would torture him in order to get information out of him. The second order he disobeyed was that Kennedy didn't want any more daylight missions until they could build up their Air Force in the area because they were too vulnerable to not only anti-aircraft fire, but being shot down by the Zeros. They were only sending a few B-17s over time. So in both cases, he disobeyed orders. He thought it was his place to go out with the men to see how they were doing and to offer them some moral support. And again, he sent out a mission in daylight. Well, on this last mission of his plane was shot down. According to a friend of mine who lives in Rabaul and has researched this, the attack came from the north, dropped their bombs over Rabaul and headed south, and the Japanese Zeros shot the plane up. It was losing altitude. Only 2 people bailed out of the plane. They were later captured and executed. The plane to this day has never been found. We don't know where it is crashed, but there are logging companies now who started logging in this area. And this friend of mine who lives in Rabaul has put the word out to keep an eye out for this B-17. I might also add, in recent years, I've been in contact with one of the sons of General Walker. He came with me to Fredericksburg, Texas some years ago when I helped put together a symposium on the missing in action. And at one time, he had put together a plan to actually go back there with an expedition to see if they couldn't find his father's plane. But he apparently got hit pretty hard by the economic downturn we had about 5 years ago, and he had to cancel the operation. But I'm still in regular contact with him, and who knows, perhaps someday we'll be able to go back and put that expedition back together. Now, not all the missing in action were actually missing in action, and we had quite a few operational losses, planes just simply going out and disappearing over the ocean or flying into a cloud that had a rock in it. Papua New Guinea today is the one country in the world that has the most missing aircraft. It's an estimated between 500 and 600 aircraft are somewhere in the jungles and mountains of Papua New Guinea. Some of them have been found more recently, some not. But this is where I live in Taranaki, New Zealand. I have a little house down here. This is Mount Taranaki. These are the Puakai Ranges over here. And in 1943 in Oxford, but went off on a training mission and never came back. They just assume it got lost over the Tasman Sea. But in 1974, a goat hunter who was out hunting for goats down here in the Puakais came across a crash site with skeletal remains in it. So they found out all these years later that it hadn't disappeared over the Tasman Sea, but had crashed relatively low elevation here in the Puakai Range. And this is a local museum that has parts from that Oxford that they found. Also, we have a few issues. I have a few issues with MIA recovery versus relic hunters. As I said, there are an estimated 500 to 600 missing aircraft in Papua New Guinea alone. It'll take forever for JPAC to locate all of these, find any remains in them, having them identified. In the meantime, these old aircraft are big business. Anything from World War II has value now as an artifact. So there are individuals and groups now that are going back to places like Papua New Guinea, going through the mountains and jungles, recovering aircraft or even just parts to the aircraft so that they can be reassembled and sold for big bucks. And these are just two examples that I pulled off the internet. A P-51 Mustang that was put together and sold for $2.7 million. Here's a P-38 that sold for 3.8 and another one that sold for 7. Now, I'm all for recovering these wrecks and putting them together, making them fly again, or donating them to museums. But there's so much money involved in this that these individuals, a lot of them, are not giving any consideration to any skeletal remains that may be in there, and they're just discarding them. So even though there are family members alive today who could find some closure to a greater effort being put into recovering and identifying these remains, I'm afraid the rush to find these old wrecks and to make money off of them has precluded the former, that is, finding the remains and having them identified. And I have come in contact with some of these individuals and groups who actually make a living, a very good living, going out and recovering some of these old wrecks. But when they find out that my interest in talking to them has to do with MIA recovery, then my screen goes blank. They don't want to talk to me. Other colleagues of mine who work actively in this have told me that these wreck sites are considered war graves. It's illegal to go in there and disturb them until the proper authorities have a chance to go in there first. So what they're doing basically is breaking the law. They're making money out of it. I think they're doing us a service in the sense that they're recovering these things and putting them back together. But there's the other side of the coin, and that is not being able to identify any personnel in there. And before I close, these are just a couple of websites you might want to jot down. Justin Talon is a friend and colleague of mine, and he has an incredible website. It's called PacificRex.com. You can literally spend weeks going through it. If you have any questions about the Pacific War, especially the Southwest Pacific Theater of War or MIA issues, go there. He has a search engine there. Punch in a name, punch in an island, punch in anything you want, and you'll probably find the answer there. Also, Ted Darcy, I mentioned earlier, he has his own website. Pat Scannon, Bent Prop website. These are all sites worth exploring if you have any interest in this. And that's it. I think I finished in reasonable time. Anybody who wants to come back at 12:15, which I think is about 15 minutes, to watch that film, I don't think you'll be sorry for it. So thank you for coming.